Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adeola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. The MBBA is the largest association of predominantly African American attorneys in New York. Our aim is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation around justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process. Today, we are going to be talking about protesters' rights.
Joining us now is Javionte Johnson of the Neighborhood Defender Service, as well as Jamal Wilkerson, president and founder of the Urban Agenda Group. So welcome, Javionte. Welcome, Jamal. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So as we know, there's been a ton of protests that have been going on, and rightfully so, in response to the unjust death shooters and murders of folks such as Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd, as well as of Ahmaud Arbery. Let's start with this. Why are protests so important? Jamal, I know you've had a lot of experience in this way and being able to organizing and participating in them. Why are protests so important to protecting our rights?
Honestly, it is a way for us to actually lift our voices. So the elected officials and the powers that be hear what the people actually have to say. We've been protesting since the beginning of time about different things, from just human rights to voters' rights and so forth. So we're at the point now where it's remembering that we need to get out there. We need to hear our voices, give the people a platform, because a lot of times I think people kind of get confused thinking that we have to go where the politicians want us to go. And instead, the politicians will follow your lead as their constituency and as their community and do the right thing.
Right. And so to that end, what are people's rights as a protester?
Yeah, it's important to know your rights as a protester. And start off, we all know about our constitutional rights, our right to freedom of speech, our right to freedom of assembly, as well as our right of freedom of press. And that's all included in the First Amendment. And each of those encompass different things. So for example, with the freedom of speech, that freedom encompasses a freedom to chant, a freedom to march, a freedom to protest. As well as with the freedom of assembly, that essentially means that you are free to peaceably assemble in any public space. And then with the right of freedom of press, now we might think of this as, journalism or something, but that actually extends to ordinary civilians such as you and me. Freedom of press means that we can actually videotape or take photos of anything going on in public places. And that is something that we should know as our rights as protesters before heading out.
Great, thanks, Javonte, and that's really important to be able to know. So Jamal, there have been a number of anti-police brutality protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. What have you been seeing during these marches?
Honestly, I've been seeing, and that's actually a really good question. Honestly, I've been seeing just people that have come together peacefully that want their voices heard. They want to show that what's going on isn't right, that we do need to change legislation. We do need to make sure that police respect our rights as citizens. And this is what these young people who have led many of these demonstrations really want. They're saying that things have not changed enough since the 1950s, 40s, and 30s. What we saw with George Floyd's death was actually a lynching at the end of the day. And that was streamed around the world. And people saw that and were outraged. And I think we're just at the right time in the moment to be able to change legislation, policy, and so forth to actually get things actually turned around with policing and making those bad police officers seeing them held accountable.
Right. And so, in addition to that, the way that protesters have been interacting with the police in terms of what those interactions look like have varied, right? So some of them have been great and okay, and some of them have not been good at all. So what is some of the advice that you would specifically give to protesters as it relates to their encounters with the police?
Yeah, as someone in the legal profession, I think that if I know someone who's going out to protest, or even if I'm personally going out to protest, a few things that I would, just to give advice on. One, always think about your safety, your personal well-being, the well-being of those around you. But with that, always be prepared that there is going to be a possibility that you may be detained and or arrested during these protests. It's a very real possibility, and that's something that you should think about. But also, before you go out, you should, if you do have a lawyer, write that lawyer's name down in permanent marker on your arm or somewhere that you can easily see, that's easily accessible in the event that you are arrested. If you don't have a lawyer, don't fret. There's nothing to worry about in that aspect, because here in New York City, there's actually multiple hotlines that provide you with legal representation. If you call them and let them know your situation, they will try to get you connected to the best public defender or defender organization available. And an example of that defender organization hotline may be someone like Good Call that you can call, and they'll put you through any borough through New York City. They're 24/7. So that's what a lot of protesters have been using, specifically here in New York, but in other areas, there will be similar places. Also, this is something that you don't think about, but disable your fingerprints on your phone. That is a way, unfortunately, if you are have a police encounter during protests, they can use your fingerprints if you're handcuffed to open up your phone to possibly delete videos or something. Don't carry any contraband. That's kind of a tip that goes, under the radar. But most importantly, if you're going to do this, be safe about it and make your social media private. There have been a number of instances, a number of clients actually coming to us or coming to me or my organization saying, hey, we think somebody is on our profile or trying to hack our profile, look into our profile. And sometimes if you post your protest or post some type of activity linked to a protest, that can alert the police, and that might unnecessarily put you in danger if you're not prepared for that. So that would be my advice.
Right, and can you also talk about, protests are not new, right? Can you talk about how social media has changed the dynamic of protesting?
Most definitely. I believe, and I'm sure Jamal would be able to speak more so on the protester front, but as far as the legality of what protesting and social media has done together, like I just mentioned, a lot of instances where if you aren't careful about what you post on social media, the police department and in sorts the prosecution, the district attorney office can build a case against you. They can go to your social media. They can use those very photos that you posted that you might, think that there was nothing wrong or there's nothing illegal about these photos. However, a prosecutor or a police department may disagree with that, and they may use that as evidence. Also, it could potentially put in danger your family members or your friends who you also take those photos with. So I think that social media, the advent of social media now in this protest age, while it has been fantastic, there are some concerns or some, setbacks that might come with it, such as, again, being more exposed to the potential of being incriminated or in something.
I will say this, that there is a difference between protesting, rioting, and looting. And a lot of times, the police departments throughout the country love to link the rioting with the protests. And they won't call it a protest. They'll say, oh, well, riots are happening. So just to change the narrative of what's really going on. Some of your best practices that I've seen with police departments are ones that's willing to watch what's going on to make sure that nothing goes, as they would say, goes left. And you end up with someone in your protest that just wants to cause mischief or trouble. And those things are looked at even by the protesters, as someone or a couple of elements that you do not want there. And they're willing to point those people out because they know we don't want the message of what's really needs to be said lost in the conversation. And as far as social media is concerned, social media has been used as a major tool really to gather people and let them know, hey, this is where this rally or this protest is happening. This is the meeting point. You need to come out here, voice your frustrations, but also come peacefully. And another part of best practices has been, when it comes to police department, working in conjunction with the lead organizers of whatever protest, has been just speaking to the protesters and letting them know, hey, as a lead organizer, we're going to have a peaceful protest. You're putting it out there from the door, so nothing gets misconstrued and or misinterpreted. So you need that to actually happen in the very beginning of the protest, and you'll notice that the ebb and flow of the protest works a lot better, and there's so much more connectivity with it. So within the people. So I think that's where we're at.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we just keep hearing these narratives, just depending, frankly, on, I personally think a lot of it has to do with, what it is you want to hear, right? Do you, some folks, will see the same folks go out there and say, that's a example of someone exercising their First Amendment rights and fighting against something such as a police brutality. Some other folks may come in and just may decide that that's not what they want to see. And they may just say that, no, what I see is a whole lot of rioters, what I see in a whole lot of looters. And, that's one of the challenges, which I think it's been this way for a long time. But, you could have just about everybody doing the right thing. But if someone is looking for folks who are going to feed into a particular narrative that they already want to have about a certain group of folks, that's what they're going to look for. And that to me is a part of why, we hear some of these narratives about rioters and looters and what have you. And, I think, Javionte, what you're saying about social media, for as long as, we tell people, don't say anything when you're in the custody of the police. That's because anything you say can, quote unquote, be used against you. But now that we have social media, that social media can also be used against you in some type of way. And people don't always think about that. We're always so quick to be able to want to post everything that we don't always think about that side of things. So actually to Javionte, so let's say you are at a protest and let's say you find yourself, under arrest. What is it that you should do?
Well, I think you just actually touched on the most important part, Jason. Like you said, before social media, we would always, and we still say to this day, stay silent. Do not say anything. It's interesting to see how many people know to stay silent. However, they still might, talk to the police officer during all of that. And even during all of these recent events, especially when the protesters were at its height, I had people who were being arraigned and coming through the courts on protesting charges. And it would be interesting because on those complaints, they would have quotes or they would have statements inside the complaints of what, my client may have said, but my client at the time was only asking the officer, why they were, arresting them, or they might have been trying to explain away what was happening, that they were peacefully protesting. But as Jamal astutely pointed out, they like to mix protesters and rioters together. And those statements might be on the complaint as well. So the most number one emphasis, if you do find yourself being arrested, is to stay silent. And then the next thing that you want to do is you want to invoke what's called your right to remain silent and your right to an attorney. Due to, again, the Constitution, and namely the Bill of Rights and the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says that you have a right to remain silent. You have a right to not incriminate yourself. And the Sixth Amendment says that you have a right to an attorney. So both of those things are the two only statements that you really, really want to make to the police officers who are arresting you. You want to say, I want to remain silent, and you want to say, I want an attorney. Again, you do not want to try to explain what happened, and you do not want to consent to any searches. And this includes a search of yourself on your personal body, as well as a search of any electronic devices. Remember earlier I did, mention not to, change from a fingerprint passcode and actually do a numeric passcode or something of that nature, because again, the police may try to get your consent and use your fingerprint for that passcode. But if you have a numeric passcode, they can't do that. They can't go inside your mind and figure out that passcode. So that's another reason why we say that, as well as, this is a little bit lesser known, but try not to, one, do not consent to a DNA swab, but two, try not to accept anything from the police that they can retrieve your DNA from, only because sometimes you might be a minor and practices and other legalities say, you're not supposed to receive DNA swabs without, parents present and things of that nature. So there's a lot of things, but generally we always advise our clients, do not consent to any DNA swabs, and try your best if you can help it. Don't drink any sodas, don't accept any gum or candy if you can, because those are methods in which police officers, in our experiences, have gotten DNA.
Brian, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, I guess when all of these things are happening, sometimes it can be a little bit chaotic or not. And a lot of times people feel like they should just comply, right? And so what are some of the scenarios that have come up where the police were able to make it seem as though you should say yes to something? You should say yes to providing your consent or your password or whatever, when really you had the opportunity to say no.
I actually just had, about 2 weeks ago, a client come through where she was being told that she was being arrested for one thing to the police by the police officers, in which she kind of felt that she was going to be able to explain, hey, I wasn't actually doing this thing. And, you can't charge me with that because this is what I was actually doing. Well, it turns out by the time that the client came to me in court, and, I was actually able to read over the client's criminal complaint, there were different charges than what was told to her. And what I told her that I suspected is that they realized that she actually wasn't doing anything. However, they took what she said because, again, her statements were in the criminal complaint, and they were able to try to form criminal charges against her based on what was already said to them. And I think that, it can be a very jarring experience, especially, as a young Black person or a Black person protesting police brutality, or even a person of color protesting police brutality. You feel that they have all the authority in that situation. However, you should always remember that you do have a constitutional right, and you are always allowed to exercise those constitutional rights, namely, one, remaining silent, and two, asking for an attorney. And if you remember, even if you don't have an attorney, don't be afraid, don't be scared or anything. You should probably always have somebody's phone number written on you, a family member, a trusted friend, so that way you can call them and let them know, hey, I'm being taken, or I'm at such and such precinct. Please let everybody know, please let the family know, and please start looking for lawyers to contact if we don't already have any lawyers. So always remember to make that one phone call. Even though it is being monitored, you are allowed to make that one phone call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Jamal, as we've been saying, there have been a ton of protests that are going on, and it's so good to see that. And I know that you played a role in organizing a number of protests, whether it's in Queens or whether it's just, generally in New York City. In fact, I think there's one that's going to be going on this Saturday that you're helping to organize.
That's correct.
What have you been seeing, right? Like, have you been seeing instances where there has been some type of misconduct, or, what have you been seeing when it comes to, encounters with the police? And in addition, and even if it's not something that you've seen yourself, what are some things that maybe you've heard from some of your, some of the other protesters out there? If, for example, things have gone pretty well, which I think that they generally have, with some of the stuff that you've put together.
Right, and well, well, two parts on that is one, I've seen a lot of best practices when it comes to a lot of the smaller protests. And I will say smaller as in maybe about 150 to 200 people coming on out to protest.
You've come a long way, man. 150 to 200 is a small protest. That's what I like to
Yeah,
hear.
exactly.
Right.
The one I did a few weeks back ended up with about 400 or so people. And that went very smoothly. Respect was shown on both sides. And I think that goes to the fact that, you know, like I said, from the door of the tone of the protest. So where some people have said, hey, I've been sprayed with tear gas. I've been sprayed with pepper spray. I have an intern at my regular day job who he's 19 years old. And he's gone out to Manhattan. He's from Staten Island. He's gone out to Manhattan to protest, and he's coming back with stories of getting pepper sprayed. And he's telling me, well, you know, I'm okay, but it's not the normal pepper spray. I don't think. He's like, so I'm coming out there this time with gargles. So him and his friends are going out with gargles, knowing that they're probably going to end up getting pepper sprayed some more. Couple of people may end up getting pushed from the police. So he's had some really rough encounters, and along with some of his friends that have gone out there to protest. But and he was going out at a time when the looting was going on, because at the end of the day, it still breaks up between who's a protester, who's a rioter, and then who's a looter. And so at that point, you have police painting it with a broad brush, saying everybody's all together, which goes back to understanding protesters' rights, because a protester who's just out there to protest, he or she is going to be is going to want to talk to the police and say, hey, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not, it's not me doing X, Y, and Z. And yes, yeah, and you're right. Mr. Johnson's right when it comes to, hey, you're giving up too much information. Maybe you need to be quiet and not say anything, because now they're going to take what you said and totally flip it on you. And so where you're going to need now that attorney, but because you were doing the right thing, you're like, hey, I'm trying to abide by the law. I don't want police brutality. So I'm out here marching against police brutality. I'm marching for, I want equality across the board. I want my human rights, my human dignity to be not trampled on. And so I'm willing to comply with the NYPD or whatever police department, but now you're jamming me up because I said too much to you. So I think all of that actually, and that's why I'm happy to be on this panel, because honestly, that's what tends to get us jammed up a lot of times.
Right. And so, you know, I guess to add to that, if someone witnesses someone being arrested by the police, what should they do?
Yeah, so if you witness someone being arrested by the police, and there's two ways that this can go. Let's talk about the way that in which you know the person being arrested. If you know the person that is actually being arrested, make sure that you know their information, their date of birth and everything. But remember to try to contact that legal hotline. It's always good to try to research before you go out to protest. It's not always the most feasible thing to do, to research a legal hotline. But for example, again, if you're in New York City, the Good Call hotline is a 24/7 legal counsel hotline to find you legal representation. So if I'm protesting in any of the 5 New York City boroughs, I'm probably going to have the Good Call number written on my arm in permanent marker. I'm going to document everything. I'm going to try to take as many photos as possible of the arrest or video of the arrest, and trying to make sure that I am, as an individual, am being safe, because we've seen videos that sometimes when people are being arrested, it's a very chaotic scene. And sometimes, you know, police officers may be going after other people who are being arrested, and you may also be swept into that arrest, you know, while other people are being arrested. So make sure you are yourself being presently safe as an individual, but try to document that. Call the legal hotline once you are at a safe place, at a place after the protest. And this will be helpful for any potential court court case or conversely, any civil suits against the police department who made the arrest. Secondly, if you don't know the person, this is something that we teach our legal observers with the National Lawyers Guild. Legal observers are people, if you all been to protests, I'm sure Jamal have seen them. They wear like the green hats, and they don't actually march or protest, but they're neutral observers. What we train those legal observers to do is we tell them to call out to that person being arrested. We know that it is, again, sometimes a hectic, chaotic situation, but call out to that person, yell, what is your name? Yell, what is your date of birth? Write those things down. Take those things down if you are able to at that time. Try to remember them as best as possible if you are able to at that time. And then, again, document everything. So that way you can call a legal representation hotline, or you can contact the local National Lawyers Guild to let them know that you witnessed someone being arrested and you have information just in case that court case ever comes up.
I just kind of want to emphasize that, you know, if you do witness or if you are the victim of police brutality, very similar to what Javionte had said, you just want to make sure that you get the name and badge number and the description of the officer to the extent you can, the exact time of the location, a description of the incident, including any medical attention that you received, and any identifying information regarding any of the witnesses that we have out there. What is it that you're hoping to see from these protests? It seems like this is different, you know, than it was even just like, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. What are you hoping that will actually come from the protests that we've been seeing in Queens, we've seen in Manhattan, and we've seen all over the city and frankly, all over the country?
Honestly, I'm looking at just true legislative reform, not just policy. And I think a lot of times that gets misconstrued as well. NYPD at one point was saying, well, it's policy to not have a chokehold, but it took the city council to pass legislation to say, hey, now if you chokehold someone and you kill them, guess who's being held criminally responsible? You are. So that's where what I'd like to see more of, more real legislation coming out, whether it's on a local level, state level, or on a federal government level. There really needs to be policy, legislation actually taken care of. Also, legislation that stops bad police officers from going from one spot to another. So just because you got booted from New York City for being a egregious officer, and now you're going to Chicago to take the job of over there. So there needs to be a law passed that says you're not going to be able to get another job in law enforcement because at the end of the day, you were not able to serve and protect. You did not want that to happen. You went about it a whole nother way of bullying and hurting people that it was uncalled for. So no, legislation is key.
Thank you so much for that. But we want to thank all of you for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
Stay safe out there.